Now that I've updated the layout for the activity to have the widgets that I want in it, let me go to the, well, actually before I go to the Java code, I still need to add some IDs. Let me add the IDs and then we'll go to the Java code and we'll work with these guys. So the text view, I want to define an ID. So that brings up my Android : ID. And the first suggestion is at plus ID with a slash after it. The plus means I am defining an ID. Later, when I reference it within the same file, I'll just use add ID to refer to it. So let's call this something imaginative like, I don't know, text view. And then on the edit text, let me give that an ID as well, which will be edit text. And even on the button, I can then say ID is my hello, at plus ID slash hello button. There. Now all of my widgets actually have IDs in them so I can look them up. I will now go back to my main activity.java. In the main activity, one of the primary things you do in the onCreate method is you look up all the widgets you're going to need. So I'm going to make my edit text and my text view attributes of this class so that I can set them in onCreate and use them wherever else I need inside the application. The button itself, I'm going to make a local variable in onCreate and add a listener right inside there and then use it outside that. So starting with the attributes, here's my main activity. I'm going to put in private text view, semicolon. I'm also going to put in a private edit text, semicolon. And inside the onCreate, after setting the content view, which will inflate all the widgets, make them all available, I'm going to say the text view is equal to, and the method I want out of activity is find view by ID. All of those IDs that I added inside the layout will be available from the R class, r.id. And then here are all the IDs that have been predefined as well as the ones I added. So when I say text_view, it shows up right away. Now, this is called a resource ID. It needs to be an integer. Find view by ID does not return a text view. It returns a parent class called view. View is the parent of all of the visible widgets inside of Android, everything that we're going to use. So we're going to need to add a cast. Once again, Alt-Enter turns out to be our simple response to this. It says, oh, do you want to cast to android.widget.textView? I do, actually. And then I just need a semicolon at the end, and I've taken care of assigning the text view. The similar process happens with the edit text. I'll say find view by ID, r.id.editText. I then do an Alt-Enter to cast it to edit text and then put a semicolon at the end. And now I have looked up both of my visible widgets and assigned them to attributes in a very simple manner. The next step is going to be a little bit more awkward because in addition to looking up the button, I need to assign a listener to it. If you have used a GUI toolkit of any kind, you're familiar with the fact that buttons generate click events. And then you need to implement some way to respond to a click event. So I'm going to use the term button here, which is an android.widget. Notice as soon as I hit enter on that, it added the import statement on line 7 right there. And I will call it my hello button is equal to find view by ID, r.id.hello button. If I hit Alt-Enter this time, it thinks I want a static import, but if I put the semicolon at the end and come back, then it goes, oh, you want to cast this to button? I do, actually. And now I have looked up my button as well. For the button, I now want to set an on-click listener, and the argument is something that implements an interface known as a view.onClickListener. If I say new onClickListener and hit enter, then what I am doing is the ever popular anonymous inner class mechanism from Java. Anonymous inner classes are what Java has forced us to use because prior to Java 8, there was no way to treat a method as an object. Once Java 8 came along, we had these things called lambdas, and you can replace anonymous inner classes with lambdas. Does Android support lambdas? Not yet. Will they? It depends on the people creating the environment. Again, this doesn't correspond to any particular edition of Java, so it's up to the people at Google as to when they will support various features. An anonymous inner class uses the word new with the name of an interface or a different class. And what it does is it creates a class that extends or implements this interface. So extends the class or implements this listener, this interface, and provides, obviously I need to provide an implementation for the method inside it on click, and it also, once it's created that class, instantiates it. So effectively what I've done is between the open paren and the closed paren down here, I've stuffed in an entire class definition and instantiated it. It's anonymous because I didn't have to make up a name for it on my own. This is something we used to do a lot back in the old Swing days and is still required now in Android. The onClick method takes a view as an argument. That view will be the button itself, but I don't really need the button in order to decide what to do. What I want to do is I want to say hello. Now, I'm going to make this a special separate method. I'm going to call say hello with the view as the argument. And I get a warning saying, wait a minute, there is no say hello method. So again, I'll do an Alt-Enter and let it create a method called say hello in the main activity. And you can see it put it right below it, right below my onCreate method. I do want the void return type, that's correct. I do want the view argument, that's correct. V is fine for an argument, and now it'll put me inside it. Now, I want to make one change to this method signature before I go on for reasons that will become clear in a moment. I want to change the word private here to the word public. Again, I'll come back to why. Inside say hello, let me actually do the work. I want to extract the name from the text view and then say hello inside, extract the name from the edit text and say hello in the text view. So I say string name equals edit text dot, and you would think get text would be enough, wouldn't you? But what you can see here is that get text does not return a string, it returns an editable, so that then I have to go .toString on it to get the name. Then I'm going to say on my text view .setText, and I'll put in my string hello, comma, plus name, plus an exclamation point, and then I'm all set. I'll come back to this as well. But now I've got my implementation. I have enough to actually run. So let me rerun the app, wait for it to find my emulator. I'm not going to make it choose the same emulator each time. That would save us a little time, but I may use multiple emulators, so I'm going to leave that unchecked at the moment. And now when I go to my emulator, I expect this to go away and then come back. And now there's my form. Please enter your name and say hello. And I'll put in, for example, Dolly, and I'll click say hello, and it says hello, Dolly. And we've actually accomplished something in the Android application, however small it might be. So the application extracted the name from the edit text and then updated the text view with that. Now, to finish this section, let me make a couple more modifications. First of all, if I do a control space inside an Alt-Enter inside this string, it says, do you want to extract this as a string resource? I could actually do that, or I could replace the plus with a string.format. Why don't I do that? There's a format method in the string class. As it turns out in Android, it's a static method that says hello %s exclamation point and then takes the name as an argument. I can even take this string resource and put it in the strings.xml file if I like to. And I can go ahead and do that a little bit later. I'll leave that as it is right now. The next thing I want to do, however, is explain why I made this method public. And to do that, let me go back to my activity, make this full screen again, and add a second button. So here's a second button which I'll make layout width, wrap content, and height wrap content. And I'll put in the text this time will be say hi rather than say hello. Of course, then I do my Alt-Enter to put it as a string resource. I'll call this the hi button label. But what I'm not going to do this time, what's different, is I'm not going to put it in ID. And the reason I'm not is I'm going to add another attribute this time called onClick. When you say onClick, it looks for methods in the activity that match that signature, that are public, void, and then the method name, and then take a view as an argument. And this is a way of saying, and of course it only sees one. It sees the say hello method. When I hit enter, it says, okay, now I already am configured to call the say hello method automatically. If I put in a method that didn't exist, it would offer to make one for me. That was public, void, method name with a view as an argument. This allows me to avoid having to write the anonymous inner class. You see, this is enough to make that button work. I mean, let me demonstrate this right now. I'll just run the app immediately. Wait for the prompt to come up with the emulator in it. Say OK. Go back to the emulator. And then we're going to have two buttons. We're going to have the say hello method button, and the say hi button. And if I put in Dolly again, I click say hi, and that works exactly the same way as the other one. Put in Fred, say hello still works too. They're both working fine. Now, by the way, of course, these are not really tests. These are demos. Tests will come later, but at least you can see that the buttons are working properly. So, what did I add? I added a second button with an onClick handler, and inside the main activity, it found that method immediately. Now, the downside to using the onClick attribute is if I'm just looking at the Java code, I have no idea who's calling this, and that second button doesn't even show up in the Java code, so I don't even know it exists or what it's doing. The downside of the anonymous inner class is that even though now I can see what it does and where it comes from, I have to write the anonymous inner class. So you can pick whichever one you want based on your own personal preference. There is only one restriction that matters, and it's that in order to use this onClick handler, you must be calling an activity method. You can't do this with a fragment. Fragments are a large topic that we will briefly address later and in much more detail address in a second video course. I have a lot more to say about them, but let me at least mention them here because they came up. A fragment is a portion of an activity that you can modify independently of the rest of the activity. So conceptually, they're not hard at all. It's just the coding gets a little bit involved. So here I have my say hello method with multiple buttons that call it, one that uses anonymous inner class, one that uses the onClick handler, and I actually have an app that does something. In the next section, we'll start talking about how to modify this application so that we could look at alternative layouts and providing specialized resources.